Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of the origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origins Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision.
It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Green, Senior Research Associate and Adjunct Associate Professor in the Department of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Case Western Reserve University, and Research Hydrologist at the U.S. Forest Service's Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in North Woodstock, New Hampshire. Dr. Green studies the role of forests in regulating the water cycle and how this impacts energy, carbon, and nutrient ecosystem budgets. He uses data-intensive analysis to elucidate forest responses to natural variability, climate change, and forest management. Tonight, Dr. Green will talk with us about climate change impacts on water in northeastern U.S. forests. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Green.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to share my research on climate change and its impact on water resources in eastern U.S. forests. I've been conducting this research for about 10 years now, and it's afforded me some pretty interesting opportunities, none more interesting than becoming a certified tower climber in order to make the types of measurements that one needs to in order to track water use by forests. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the context for my research lies in this startling time series of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And so what we're looking at here is the time series of CO2 that is measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. They collect an air sample every day, analyze it for CO2 concentrations, and this is the time series that they've constructed. The increase, the very clear increase, is consistent with fossil fuel combustion or the magnitude of fossil fuel use. And so we attribute this to the increase in fossil fuel usage. And if we put that increase in the context of the geologic record of CO2 concentrations, in this case coming from ice cores, you can see that that record is pretty much a straight up deviation from the type of variation that we've observed over the last 800,000 years. So this increase in CO2 concentration is predicted to have major impact on Earth's temperature because CO2 has been known for a little over a century now to be a greenhouse gas. And what that means is that CO2, it absorbs infrared radiation and then re-emits it into the atmosphere. And so for Earth, solar radiation, incoming solar radiation, reflects off of Earth's surface. The infrared radiation that is reflected and interacts with CO2 molecules is absorbed. And so if the concentration of those molecules increases, there's a higher probability of capturing that infrared radiation and trapping it in the atmosphere, and thus creating a greenhouse effect. And that greenhouse effect is a good thing in some respects, that it protects us from the pool of space, but at the levels that it's currently experiencing, we're seeing global warming because of this. And so if we look at the long-term temperature time series, in this case, the time series that was published with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their 5th assessment report, you can see that global air temperatures have increased by about 0.8 degrees C over the last 100 years. So this increase in air temperature has numerous implications, but the implications that I think about and that we're going to talk about here are related to the hydrologic cycle. So the basic question that motivates my research is, how is the hydrologic cycle responding to climate warming? And I focus specifically on temperate forests. My system of focus, my laboratory is in the Northeastern United States. And so that's the system that I'm watching respond to climate change. And thinking about forests is important strategically for the Eastern United States. Here we're looking at a reconstruction of forest cover across the lower 48. And across the eastern half of the US, in particular the Northeast, it constitutes about 70% of the land surface. So it's the major land cover for the Northeastern US. And so we need to be able to predict how the major land cover in the region is responding to climate change, and in particular, how it's altering the hydrologic cycle. So when I talk about the hydrologic cycle, you probably have an image in your mind about, a simplified version that you've seen in grade school or other places. But I want to talk about that cycle in the context of forests, just to be very clear about the processes that I think about. So as precipitation is falling onto a forested canopy, what I think about is first how the canopy is intercepting that precipitation. How much is being captured and made available back to the atmosphere, or made available to be evaporated back to the atmosphere, and how much of it is making it through the forest canopy and to the soil surface. In the Northeastern U.S., if it makes its way to the soil surface, it's usually going to be infiltrated into the soil. And if it's infiltrated, then it's recharging soil water, which makes it available again to be taken up by trees, to be transpired back into the atmosphere. Some of it, depending on the moisture levels, might work its way down and percolate deeper into the groundwater. If it makes its way to the groundwater, there's a good possibility eventually it's going to work its way into streams and rivers and eventually drain the landscape. So that's the full hydrologic cycle that I'm going to be thinking about and sharing my research related to. So as a hydrologist, I need to be thinking quantitatively about that hydrologic cycle. And so the way that we do that is we construct water budgets. And so here's what a typical simplified water budget for the Northeastern US might look like. Maybe about 50 inches of precipitation annually falling on the Northeastern US. Of that 50 inches, about half of it annually is going to end up back in the atmosphere via two pathways. The first is evaporation, which is really just 20% of the total flux back to the atmosphere. 80% of that flux is via transpiration, what we colloquially might know as plant water use. That which isn't moved back to the atmosphere is then drained off of the landscape. So in this case, we're assuming no net change in groundwater or soil water storage, which tends to be approximately true over enough years. And so with that background, what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on three specific aspects of hydrology. I'm going to talk about precipitation changes that we've detected. I'm going to talk about changes in snowpack and snow storage that's occurred. And I'm mostly going to focus on evapotranspiration or transpiration that is being altered by climate change. But I want to take a minute to think a little bit more carefully and define that transpiration process, because you maybe haven't thought about that as much as evaporation. So with transpiration, if you were to take a leaf of a tree, turn it over, look at the bottom under a microscope, you'd see all these mouth-like structures like what I'm showing here on this slide. Those are stomata. Those are the primary organelles by which, or the organs by which gas exchange occurs between the tree and the atmosphere. And those stomata are primarily there to exchange carbon dioxide. They're there to open up to accept carbon dioxide via diffusion so that the leaf can conduct photosynthesis, synthesize sugars, and then transport it into the tree so that the tree can grow or use it for maintenance. But as a consequence, the tree loses water. It's 100% relative humidity inside that stomate. And so as it's opening, or when it's open to accept the carbon dioxide, it's incidentally losing water to the atmosphere. It opens during the day when photosynthesis is happening. It would close sometimes during the day if the plant is under stress, if it doesn't have enough soil water to supply the plant, if it doesn't have the nutrients to conduct enough photosynthesis. So those are sort of the factors that determine how these stomata function. These stomata have global importance because they are a major pathway, or because they control a major flux of water back to the atmosphere. And because they're sensitive to carbon dioxide concentrations, they can control evapotranspiration or water fluxes simply due to changing CO2 concentrations. So if the concentration of CO2 increases, those stomates don't need to be open as long to capture the amount of CO2 that they require to conduct photosynthesis. And so they can open, they can open for a shorter period of time, and then they can stay closed a little bit longer. As a consequence, when we conduct upscaling activities to the continental scale with our global hydrologic models, it suggests that river flows at the continental scale should increase with increasing CO2 concentrations. So these small microscopic aspects of trees have global implications for the hydrologic cycle. So in order to study these changes in the hydrologic cycle, the tool that I use, my laboratory, is the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, a small federal facility run by the U.S. Forest Service in New Hampshire. It's a site that was established in 1955. If you were to look out the window of a plane as you were flying by Hubbard Brook, this is about what it would look like. It's a bowl-shaped, fully forested valley. It's mountainous. The three primary tree species in the valley are sugar maple, American beech, and yellow birch. There are some coniferous trees in the valley bottom and at the ridge tops. Hubbard Brook is located within the White Mountain National Forest. It's an experimental forest. It's part of a network of experimental forests that the U.S. Forest Service operates in order to improve our understanding of forests, to improve forest management. So what we do at Hubbard Brook is we have 9 small watersheds on these hill slopes where we're precisely measuring the hydrologic budgets. We're measuring the precipitation coming into this landscape. We're measuring the stream flow leaving. We're measuring the meteorology within the valley, including air temperature, relative humidity, solar radiation, and wind speed. During the winter, we're measuring the snowpack. This forest is one of the most studied forests in the world ecologically. So we're keeping track of the forest dynamics. And we're measuring the chemistry of the precipitation coming in and the chemistry of the stream flow leaving. By difference, we're able to estimate the evapotranspiration. So this is how historically we've been able to track evapotranspiration. And I use that term, I'm lumping evaporation and transpiration together since we can't break them apart with these types of measurements. So annually we get an evapotranspiration estimate as a difference between precipitation and stream flow. We measure stream flow with hydraulic weir structures. So We measure the height of the water coming over this V, and using hydraulics, we can then calculate what the flow rate is coming out of these watersheds. Since 1963, we've been taking a weekly water sample that is then sent back to the laboratory and analyzed for major ions. We've measured precipitation at about 25 different locations throughout the valley so that we can precisely characterize the amount of precipitation coming into each of these watersheds. And then similarly, we measure the precipitation chemistry on a weekly basis, the cumulative water that's built up, and then that water is also sent to the laboratory for similar chemical analysis. And so that's the context for the talk, and we'll talk about the science here shortly.
Thanks for that introduction, Mark. Of looks like a beautiful place.
Yes.
And how big a group is it that is doing this work? I mean, is this happening all over at forests like this all across the United States?
The similar measurements, the hydrologic measurements, is only made at about 5 or 6 different watersheds or 5 or 6 different sites around the U.S. The group that maintains the hydrologic infrastructure is about 8 people or so, but the whole long-term experimental group at this point includes about 200 collaborators that are conducting research there.
So we have a question from Lance. Can you comment on the difference between Udisol and Spotosol forests in your studies?
Yeah, sure.
Of course, you have to explain to the audience what Udisol and Spotosol forests are.
Yes. Well, so this is a Spotosol forest. A Unisol forest, I'm not even certain on that definition of the Unisol forest. These are spodic soils. And so the way that they've formed is the organic matter that falls onto the surface creates organic acids that leach out a certain layer in the soil. And those organic acids, the material that is weathered out of the soil ends up being deposited a little bit further down in the soil profile. So these are spodic soils, which suggests by definition are relatively acidic. Hubbard Brook, our science uses 2 primary mechanisms. We're an experimental forest, so we conduct experiments to improve our understanding of how the forest works in a very basic way. But the forest was established in 1955, and so we've been monitoring this forest for a long time. So at this point, our long-term time series have included some relatively large changes that have occurred in the atmosphere. So the long time series as well have become really vital for our ability to look at how the forest changes and then to be able to infer what's causing those changes. But the context for Hubbard Brook, it was established in the 1950s to improve our understanding of water resources and the impact of forest management on water resources. So starting with European colonization, forests started to be used more aggressively, with deforestation peaking in about the mid-1800s. By the late 1800s, there were some high-profile flooding events that occurred in basins, river basins, that had experienced heavy deforestation, and the public started to pose questions about whether the deforestation activities were having an impact on these major floods that were causing damage to mills and causing all this economic disruption. And so as a result of public awareness, Congress passed the Weeks Act of 1911 that established the Eastern National Forest System in order to preserve large tracts of land where forests would be allowed to regrow and be managed a little bit less aggressively than what was happening at the time. So it was passed, but there was still sort of nascent understanding of the quantitative link between forest management and the impact on water resources. And so at Hubbard Brook and at some of the other experimental forests around the country, we conducted whole watershed experiments. So the first one that we conducted in 1965, we clear-felled an entire watershed, about an 80-acre watershed. The trees were left in place. This was a basic experiment, so we weren't really interested in conducting logging activities. We left the trees in place and then applied herbicides for 3 years to try to prevent any vegetation from growing for those 3 years, so that we could watch the amount of additional stream flow that would come out of the forest. That was the hypothesis, that as you remove the transpiration flux, we'd see more stream flow. And then also to observe the water chemistry response in streams after the vegetation was removed. Then in 1970, we started a more management relevant treatment where we took about a third of the forest in 1970. In 1972, we took another third. In 1974, we then took the final third. And here the idea was a light-handed approach to removing the same amount of timber. What would the impact be on water resources draining from this watershed? And then finally, in 1985, we conducted a more aggressive treatment. Here, we did a whole tree harvesting experiment where we constructed logging roads, went in with heavy equipment, and removed trees and tree tops all in one fell swoop. And again, with a focus on stream responses. In this case, we were also looking a lot at the forest recovery afterwards. It was documented much more carefully than the previous two experiments. And so what we learned from these experiments, removing the vegetation, the hypothesis was true that yes, you would see more stream flow coming from forests as they were harvested, to a magnitude of about 30% more stream flow at a peak. But it only took about 10 years for stream flow to recover to pre-treatment conditions, even though that young forest looked nothing like the mature forest. It was growing vigorously, and because it was growing vigorously, it was using a lot of water, evapotranspiring a lot of water, and thus even after 10 years, we see stream flow actually a little bit lower than pre-treatment flow rates, simply because that young forest is using so much water. So that's the experimentation, an example of some of the experiments that we conducted at Hubbard Brook. Our long-term record has served as a sentinel for changes in the atmosphere. And so I'm just going to highlight one particular aspect, and that's with precipitation pH. So as atmospheric deposition, as precipitation was collected and the chemistry was initially analyzed, the scientists at the time were startled by how low the pH was. Just notice it was about 4 to 4.2 pH in those first samples that they collected. And the questions immediately arose as to why pH was so low. Well, this ended up being the discovery of acid rain in North America. And so the way that this acid rain worked, what they figured out was that it was sulfur and nitrogen oxides that were being emitted from the industrial Midwest. Those oxides were then carried in clouds towards New England and the Northeast. And then it was falling out as acid deposition onto forest soils in New England and the Northeast, changing the soil chemistry and altering the health of the forests there. So after this initial set of measurements, a policy discussion started to occur as others started to measure precipitation chemistry across the Northeast, and we showed that this was a large-scale phenomenon that was happening. Here's our full time series of precipitation pH from Hubbard Brook. So notice the remarkable recovery that occurred. our scientists were instrumental in one particular and important amendment to the Clean Air Act that occurred in 1991. Our data and our science was important in establishing this amendment and convincing lawmakers that we needed to impart laws that reduce the sulfur and nitrogen emissions coming from the Midwest and across the US. And you can see the recovery in pH that occurred shortly thereafter. So it really is a success story of how science can inform policy and improve environmental quality. And how Hubbard Brook, how these sentinel sites are critical for documenting these changes. So now let's come to how Hubbard Brook has been used as a sentinel for climate change and the impact on water resources. So here is the time series of temperature coming from our longest running temperature site. Notice it's a similar increase in temperature as I showed earlier globally, although the magnitude of this increase is about twice as much as the global increase that I showed you. You know, we started at about 41, an annual air temperature average of about 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And in more recent years, we've been a little over 44, approaching 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So about a 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase in temperature. Also notice that it's not necessarily a linear increase. It was sort of moving along, and then in about the late 1980s or so, we hit an inflection point where the warming really started to accelerate. Precipitation, our precipitation record has shown that we are in much wetter conditions since 2000. Prior to 2000, we would have reported an average annual precipitation of about 55 inches per year. Since 2000, we have about 63 inches per year. This is consistent, both the air temperature record and this precipitation increase are consistent with what's been observed across most of the Northeastern U.S., including the Cleveland area. For example, Lake Erie levels are up largely because of this increase in precipitation. And so obviously the implications here that we're concerned about and where our science is now focusing is on the intensity of these events. So more precipitation, especially if it's going to come in more intense events, obviously has implications for infrastructure damage due to flooding. Here's a photo just downstream from Hubbard Brook in Plymouth, New Hampshire, after Tropical Storm Irene rained about 7 inches within a 24-hour period. And infrastructure near the river there was underwater for about a week. The snowpack, we make measurements of the snowpack on a weekly basis during the winter. We'll go out and we'll measure the depth and the water equivalent in that snowpack since 1955. And those measurements have shown that the snowpack generally is smaller and less consistent than it used to be. It's being established a little bit later in the fall, and it's melting out a little bit sooner in the spring, and its peak magnitude is a little bit lower. The implications for this, I'm going to highlight 3 implications. That snowpack serves as an insulating blanket over the soils. And so, believe it or not, a less snowpack during the winter is going to result in cooler soils because we lose that insulating layer. And so the soils are more directly exposed to cooler air temperatures. And so we see more soil freezing as the snowpack becomes less consistent. That's a problem because it causes damage to roots, and thus forest health potentially can be impacted due to the increased freezing of soils. We also published a paper last year where we documented warmer soils due to this same phenomenon, but in this case, looking at the springtime. If we lose the snowpack earlier in the spring, that exposes the soils to the warming air temperatures. And so the soils accumulate a little bit more heat earlier in the spring, and that tends to follow through the whole growing season, and we see warmer soils during the summer. An implication there is that warmer soils are going to be less efficient at holding organic matter in them, and thus we're going to lose more CO2 to the atmosphere from those soils, and they're going to be a little bit less effective at sequestering carbon. A hydrologic implication of this is less groundwater recharge. So the way that groundwater recharge occurs is you have to saturate the whole soil profile so that you create a pressure gradient that's pushing water deeper into the ground. Well, the best conditions for accomplishing that is during snowmelt. And so if we have smaller snowpacks, we're concerned that the conditions for recharging groundwater might be a little bit less. So that's one of the aspects of this that we're going to be continuing to keep an eye on for the coming years. Okay, so now I want to turn to evapotranspiration and our annual measurements there. So as scientists started to detect global warming, one of the first expectations was that we would see rising evapotranspiration, but it didn't happen, or it hasn't happened as consistently as we would have expected. Warmer air masses can hold more moisture, and so that if we have the same amount of moisture in the atmosphere, it actually, a warmer air parcel is going to create a more drying pressure on the surface. We didn't detect it for the longest time until just recently. And so just notice our long time series of evapotranspiration at Hubbard Brook. We're varying, but it's pretty consistently right around 500 millimeters per year moving back to the atmosphere, or that we're not accounting for in our water budgets. But then in about mid-2000s to 2010, we see this sharp inflection upwards, a startling increase that we've now detected. And so we'll talk a little bit more about why this change has occurred.
What toxic effects did herbicides have in terms of regrowth and environmental damage?
Yeah, you know, at the time, the late 1960s, that wasn't on the forefront of their mind. Times have certainly changed. I have colleagues who are concerned about the herbicides that they're using, the dioxins form as a byproduct. They should have broken down by now, but there are some colleagues who won't work in that particular watershed anymore because they're concerned about dioxins. We haven't gone in and measured to see if there's any residual impact, but we haven't gone in also at that and tried to detect any changes to the forest because of the residuals.
How do you measure evapotranspiration?
So we'll talk about it in a little bit, how we measure it now. Historically, it's been, we have to trust that it's the difference, it's the water that we're not measuring coming out via the stream flow. So we know how much precipitation fell in, we can track how much stream flow left. And so we're assuming that whatever we didn't measure ended up back in the atmosphere. There's a key assumption there, and that's that the groundwater is not increasing or shrinking. And we've had a number of studies that have shown that that's approximately true.
So that's connected to Lance's question. I'm surprised that increases in amounts of rain as of late does not affect the recharge rate of groundwater level as much as snow. I said, yeah, how does the are we seeing more rain? And if so, how is that affecting this balance?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a colleague from Switzerland actually just published a paper a couple of years ago where they used water isotopes to show that summer rains end up being taken up and turned into transpiration used by the trees really efficiently. And so because of the active transpiration during the summer, it's really difficult to set up a saturated soil profile that allows the percolation of water deeper into the profile.
So does that mean, is that a model problem, or do you think that's not happening as much, very much?
Yeah, we think that it's not happening as much. So the evidence for us is that we simply aren't creating those conditions for recharging groundwater with summer rains. So even if we're getting big events, those big events are either being taken up by the trees, or the water is being shunted off because of the intensity of the storms and shunted off into streams and not ending up deeper in the ground.
Great. Dave Fidel asks, does this change in hydrology affect the animal life, especially insects?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And our long-term data, we're not certain quite yet. I have colleagues who are measuring long-term, they do these malaise trap measurements where they've monitored insect populations over the long term at Hubbard Brook, and they see some changes. And we're just now, as these climate change effects are becoming very clear, we're now starting to bring these data sets to try to address those questions. But so far, we don't have answers, but we have the data to address them. This is a startling increase in evapotranspiration, in particular because it just took off and has increased by, in this case, as much as 35% compared to the baseline at the beginning of the record. And so obviously a major question is, why is this happening? So we published a paper last year where we documented this increase and we looked at our meteorological data to look at how much has the drying potential of the atmosphere increased at Hubbard Brook, and how does that change compare to this change in the water budget that we've detected? And the answer there is the atmospheric drying potential has increased by about half of what we have detected in the hydrologic budgets. So it only explains about half of this increase. And so that suggests that the other half is probably related to something to do with the forest and transpiration dynamics that's happening maybe more at the leaf level. In addition, one of the questions that we're posing is, much like the acid rain, are we detecting a larger scale phenomenon that hasn't been easy to detect at the larger scales or at other systems around the US and around the globe? And just this year, we're starting to see papers come out in the literature that are documenting large-scale increases in evapotranspiration. And so I'll highlight this one paper that was a mix of models with remote sensing data and some ground-based data. And the models that they constructed suggest that, yes, we're seeing increases in evapotranspiration on average. But if they look at a map of these trends, it's a mixed bag. In particular, the blue area, well, I'll just orient you here first. The blue areas are where evapotranspiration is increasing, and the orange hues are indicative of decreasing evapotranspiration. And so you'll notice that the eastern half of the US has a fair amount of blue in it, suggesting that they found, or that they're finding similar trends to what we're picking up at Hubbard Brook. In addition, it seems like the equatorial regions of the globe are experiencing this increase more than non-equatorial regions. So this sort of suggests that it's the more humid areas of the globe where this increase is happening. And the more arid areas, like the western half of the US, we're not seeing this increase. But this probably relates back to what are the controls on evapotranspiration in these different climates or different ecosystems. Okay, so with these large-scale studies, though, they have a difficult time attributing the changes unless it's crystal clear at over large spatial scales. But let's talk through what the potential controls would be. So the paper I highlighted there, their conclusion was that this increase is mostly attributable to increasing warming and thus vapor pressure deficit, the drying potential or atmospheric demand that's driving the increase in evapotranspiration. But let's go back to the stomates and recall that these are the gatekeepers. Most of that evapotranspiration in these humid areas is passing through these stomates. So they're the gatekeepers. They need to be open more consistently to allow an increase like this to exist. And we would be expecting them to potentially be closed a little bit more because of rising CO2 concentrations. So it's a puzzle to try to figure out here. So one reason that they might be closed or open more could be related to soil water. They will close if trees run out of available soil water. So with wetter conditions, maybe the trees were previously water limited, and now that soils are possibly wetter, the stomates are able to stay open longer. That's one hypothesis, but our long-term data and our short-term data as well, that I'll touch on in a minute here, suggest that this is not very likely. Another possibility is that there just simply is more photosynthesis happening for some reason. At Hubbard Brook, it could be the recovery from acid rain. Rising CO2 concentrations also cause a fertilization effect on forests. Actual greenhouses, they'll pump a little bit of additional CO2 in there to fertilize plants that they're preparing to sell. So that's, we have to keep our eye on photosynthesis increasing. And related to that, longer growing seasons have been documented across the globe, and we've documented them at Hubbard Brook in response to global warming. So leaf establishment in the spring is a little bit sooner, leaf fall is a little bit later. So that's one possibility. But again, not very likely because the rates of photosynthesis and evapotranspiration on those shoulder seasons is quite low. So even though they're changing, it would be hard to impart the kind of change in evapotranspiration that we've detected. And so now we come back to this eddy covariance tower that we started the talk with. We constructed this tower in 2016 so that we could make high frequency measurements of the water flux leaving the forest. And so the way that this tower works is we measure the turbulence over the forest canopy, we characterize the turbulence, and we're characterizing the heat and the water and the carbon dioxide movement with that turbulence. The key instruments here that are making those measurements, off of a boom from this tower, there's a 3D sonic anemometer that's measuring wind speed and wind direction 10 times a second so that we can characterize the turbulence. It gets averaged down to a 30-minute estimate of evapotranspiration. Along with those wind measurements, we have a gas analyzer there that's measuring the concentration of CO2 and water so that we can see the correlation of those concentrations with the wind movements. And so we now have 5 years of high frequency data related to evapotranspiration fluxes from the forest. It's not long-term data, so it's not going to tell us why evapotranspiration changed when it did, but it's going to give us some greater insights into what drives evapotranspiration at Hubbard Brook. And so what we do is we construct a predictive model of evapotranspiration using machine learning algorithms, and we give the algorithm the variables that we know are related to processes that control evapotranspiration. And here's the ranking. We then look at the variables, and we can then rank them according to how they influence the prediction of evapotranspiration. So this is the ranking. These are the variables that were given to the algorithm and the ranking. But I just want to note, these top three are much more important than the bottom three. So that soil moisture, air temperature, and turbulence are much less important than CO2 flux is the primary, is the most sensitive variable. Well, that CO2 flux coming down into the forest at the same time that water is leaving the forest suggests that photosynthesis is the primary process that we need to be thinking about as a control on evapotranspiration. But a very close second and third is vapor pressure deficit and net radiation. So this is the atmospheric demand component to this flux of water. And so it's not as simple as we would have hoped to be able to say it's mostly photosynthesis or it's mostly the atmospheric demand. And so our research going forward is going to be trying to tease apart the relative contribution of these two major processes to this increase in evapotranspiration, and try and see if we can pick up signals at larger scales as well, at regional scales. So we're making the measurements of meteorology. Let's talk about how we might measure the photosynthesis of the canopy here. So here's an aerial photo over that flux tower. And so a basic question that we're now trying to figure out is this forest photosynthesizing more? The measurements that are being made at Hubbard Brook, there are detailed forest inventories that are conducted since the beginning of the record in the 1960s through today. And so we know how the forest is growing, which species are there, which species are falling out, which new ones are coming in. And the answer so far is that we're not seeing the forest grow more. But that's not exactly, the forest could be photosynthesizing more and not necessarily growing, because it could be respiring more. The carbon in might equal the carbon out. So the forest doesn't necessarily have to be growing. So a student from Case Western who was working with to look into some remote sensing data. We can detect photosynthesis using reflectance data and fluorescence data from satellites to pick up on canopy characteristics that are consistent with photosynthesis. And the preliminary answer that Claire came up with is that it looks like there could be more photosynthesis happening from some fluorescence data that she looked at. But further attention is going to be required for us to definitively know whether this is happening. So this is on our plate and my colleagues who are more tree physiologists to be able to figure this out in the coming years. So now I want to step back a little bit and think about what these changes mean for water resources. So wetter conditions, we're not seeing a depletion in water resources and supplies necessarily so far. The increase in evapotranspiration certainly has us concerned if we see precipitation go back down to what it was prior to 2000. That's where we could see resources starting to diminish. But so far, where supply issues are minimal. The conditions for groundwater, as I mentioned, those conditions for recharge is one of the things that we're concerned about in particular, because there's so many individual homeowners and municipalities that are reliant on groundwater as their primary water supply. And then finally, the intensification of the water cycle has been an idea for a couple decades now, in particular the impact on the increasing intensity of storms and the possibility of having longer dry periods between those storms. An idea here is that we could have the same amount of annual precipitation, but if it's coming in fewer storms, fewer larger storms, that's going to be a problem for infrastructure across the Eastern U.S. And areas around the globe that are experiencing this intensification. And so just to be clear, about that intensification, and what I mean here is it's this atmospheric pathway. So if we now are moving more water more quickly into the atmosphere and we're seeing more precipitation, it suggests, as we would expect with a warming climate, that we would see water moving through the atmosphere faster. So the hydrologic changes that we've detected are consistent with climate change so far. So this is going to be a major focus of our research into the future. And I just want to highlight that to be able to not just detect, but be able to attribute these changes to specific mechanisms, we need sentinels of change like Hubbard Brook. And so sentinels of change like Hubbard Brook don't arise without some really visionary people. So I just want to acknowledge the people that make a long-term record like this possible. So Bob Pierce here on the right was a Forest Service scientist who said yes to Herb Borman on the left here as he was a young assistant professor at Dartmouth College and wanted to bring his students over to Hubbard Brook for field trips. He convinced Gene Likens that they should start studying the forest here, and their vision resulted in our last meeting in 2019. This is the group of scientists and collaborators that came together to share what we know about the forest, what we're studying. And it's really exciting to be part of a group like this that ranges from undergraduate researchers to senior scientists who are all trying to understand how this forest is responding to climate change. So with that, I'd like to thank you.
David Helmas, I follow www.arcticnewsblogspot.com. Many scientists there think we only have 4 years left as a species due to abrupt runaway climate catastrophe. What are your thoughts about abrupt climate change?
I think it's important to keep an eye on it, especially now that we've detected such an abrupt change. I'm thinking about this much more. And I guess what I would comment on is ice has a great buffering effect on the global climate. And so as we're seeing ice depletion more quickly than expected, that's concerning just because of ice's ability to absorb heat without phase changes, that latent heat. I think a tipping point is certainly something that we need to be paying attention to.
Do you see any clear signs locally of what's happening to our forests in Northeast Ohio?
Not yet. No, the phenomenon that Claire was looking at, the reflectance of the canopy, this is part of a larger scale phenomenon that is occurring in Northeast Ohio called global greening. The satellites are picking up on a greener forest canopy across the globe. So what we've detected at Hubbard Brook could be part of that, and it potentially is something, it more than likely is happening in Northeast Ohio. And so the changes in evapotranspiration we've detected, I think shortly we're going to start looking more closely at that in Northeast Ohio as well.
Barb Fidel asked, does the shutdown because of COVID have any noticeable effect? Or is it just not long enough?
Effects on the hydrology?
On the evapotranspiration.
Yeah, it hasn't had a noticeable effect. There was a little blip in carbon dioxide concentrations, a little decrease as economic activity slowed down, but not enough for us to detect anything with this evapotranspiration. In particular, I wonder more with our record, the fact that warming started so soon, changes in climate started so soon, and it took sort of momentum in the system to build up before we see this almost threshold response in the increase. So I think it could take, a lot of years of decreased CO2 emissions and associated changes in climate change for us to see a change in evapotranspiration.
What effects does the change in the species of trees affect your studies? Here in the Midwest, we lost billions of ash to be replaced by maples, for example?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because different trees transpire at different rates. So absolutely, it's something that we started to look at right away when we detected this change. We haven't seen a systematic change in the species composition very much yet. Beech trees are experiencing beech bark disease, which has caused them to actually increase their presence. The tree gets stressed out and it sends up all these shoots out of the soil. So you actually end up with more leaf mass associated with beech trees. So that's something that's happened at Hubbard Brook. But these are sub-canopy trees. They wouldn't be moving most of the water. So it's definitely something that we're keeping our eye on. But so far, we haven't been able to attribute the change, this increase in evapotranspiration, to species changes.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.